Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. It's Monday, the 29th of June, and this is episode 78 of the Meet the Farmers podcast with me, Ben Eagle. I hope you're all really well. In today's feature, I'll be speaking to agricultural and food journalist Jez Fredenburgh. But before that, let's start the show with some news stories from the past week. In the news this week, the chemical firm Bayer is set to pay around $10.9 billion, that's about £8.8 billion, to settle about 125,000 filed and unfiled claims linked to its glyphosate-based herbicide Roundup. This includes about $1.25 billion to deal with any future actions against the company. Bayer acquired Monsanto in 2018 for $63 billion and inherited a mass of lawsuits against the company in doing so. The new executive director of Waitrose, James Bailey, who moved from Sainsbury's in April, has declared that Waitrose will never stock lower standard food imports such as chlorinated chicken and hormone-treated beef. This follows the news that more than 1 million people have signed the NFU's petition against lower standard food imports post-Brexit. And finally, a new qualification for agriculture is being developed to encourage more skilled entrants into the sector. Currently under consultation, the new T level would involve 2 years of classroom technical study, as well as a large amount of work experience. T levels would sit alongside apprenticeships and A levels as a third option for 16 to 19-year-olds. And that is the news for now. It's now time for today's main feature interview, and again this week we're featuring a non-farmer. I'm really pleased to have Jez Fredenburgh on the show. Jez is an agricultural and food journalist, currently based in Norfolk because of Corona, but soon will be back off to Portugal. Meet the farmers' friends! Today's guest grew up in France and Norfolk, once managed the press team for the deputy leader of the Green Party, has travelled widely in South America and indeed across the world, and she used to work for Farmers Weekly. Yes, I'm really pleased today to be speaking to food and farming journalist and editor at Eat Farm Now, Jez Fredenburgh. Jez, welcome to the show. There was a slim chance when we first organised this that you were going to be in Portugal, but you're not. You're actually in lovely Norfolk.
Yeah.
How's lockdown been for you?
Lockdown has actually been amazing. I'm feeling extremely lucky on lockdown. I basically I moved to Lisbon in January and then decided I kind of had this moment where lockdown was definitely about to happen in Portugal and also here. I could see it coming. And I had to make the decision whether to be locked down in an apartment in central Lisbon with no garden or anything, or quickly get on a plane and come back to like the family home, basically in North Norfolk. And I'm really glad I did because it's been lovely, actually. I had to self-quarantine in a cottage down the road for 2 weeks first. My dad is super vulnerable. But and we had this like bizarre sort of exchange of cars. I at the airport I picked up a hire car so that I avoided the trains and everything, and wearing a mask, and it was all very odd. And then I sort of saw my mum, drove to Norwich and saw my mum and dad like in this dark car park with my dad sort of signaling over here, and I had to sort of go and, you know, he put the keys on the bonnet of the car and sort of walked away into the darkness. I had to go pick the car. It was all kind of a bit ridiculous, but thankfully we've all kept safe. So I've literally not seen anybody really apart from my mum and dad for nearly 4 months now, but it has been lovely because we've got the most beautiful garden and we're right in the countryside. So early on, just all the wildflowers were coming out in the hedges, and now the garden is just stuffed full of like roses and wildflowers. It's just gorgeous. I love it.
Yeah, it does look absolutely beautiful. And I suppose it's difficult to know at this stage. When do you think you might be going back to Portugal, if at all?
Well, no, I'm definitely I'm quite. You'll probably know, Ben. I have a bit of itchy feet kind of problem, so I'm probably going back next week, hopefully.
So I gave a flavour of some of the things that you've done in the introduction, but I wonder if you could introduce yourself and tell listeners about some of the things that you're doing at the moment connected with food and farming.
Well, I suppose I wear many hats. So I sort of think of it as I have food at the center of everything that I do in terms of work. Obviously, like I had this sort of 4 years with Farmers Weekly doing mainly just agricultural journalism, but I always wanted to sort of go off and take sort of food and farming type stories more to sort of mainstream. So I've been doing that since going freelance a couple of years ago. Core of what I do is still agricultural journalism. So I do a lot of work for Farmers Guardian, written and podcast at the moment as well, which are really
Yeah, include the new podcast,
I know,
which
I
we're
know.
all enjoying.
Good. I really enjoy making it. It's a lot of fun. So I do that, and I write for other sort of farming press and that kind of thing. I do a bit of sort of agricultural PR sort of stuff on the side as well, just not the actual PR, but just writing stuff. And then
Yeah.
I've sort of branched out more into again food at the center, but more sort of big issues in food. So sort of for more the mainstream press. So what really interests me is things like global supply chains and the people that we find at the end of those supply chains. And I think that's something that we don't think about enough.
Hmm. Tell me about your early life and perhaps some influences in that time on your current interests and how you came towards this fascination with food.
I was born in France, and my parents moved to rural France in the 80s. Well, they'd lived in Syria for a bit. They lived in Aleppo for a while. My dad was working on an agricultural research station out there while my mum was teaching. And that sort of developed their or my dad's fascination with farming. And it was too expensive to farm in the UK if you didn't already have a farm, basically, or weren't going to inherit one. But the French government was giving away cheap loans to young people, and you didn't have to be French. And so they found this really rundown old farm in the middle of La Vienne, which is between Limoges and
Oh,
Poitiers, just north of La Limousin.
yeah, beautiful.
Yeah, really gorgeous. And did it up and started France's first deer farm.
Wow.
And
Right.
yeah, and I've actually been recording a podcast with them, just probably for our own use, the last few weeks about that period because it was so interesting, and there were all sorts of bizarre things that happened, and funny people and funny animals and all sorts of things. And so I grew up there, and we would just have like every summer. It was wonderful and it was beautiful, and every summer we'd have about 30 friends and family that would descend farm for the whole summer, and it was just amazing. It was like this incredible summer camp.
So skipping ahead a few years, you studied international relations and geography at Sussex. What led you to that, and tell me about that time?
Um, I think my dad had a massive influence actually. Dad is a very interesting person, although he doesn't think of himself like that. But he's someone who I think growing up with him, you know, he's always talking about farming and food and politics a lot as well, and the world. And my mum and dad have like traveled a lot. You know, they like I said, they lived in Syria, they've lived in Amsterdam. Obviously, I grew up in France. I used to hear all these amazing stories of them. They did this huge drive, like a road trip with my grandparents in the 70s to India, and then got a boat across to Kenya, and
Wow.
then dropped my grandparents off, who were going to live in Kenya, and carried on up through the Sahara, through the Congo and everything, and back to Europe. And so I kind of grew up with all those sorts of things, and like the
Yeah,
whole
yeah, yeah.
house is like stuffed full of things like African sort of, I don't know, like gourds and like Syrian cloths, or you know, that kind of stuff. So I think global stuff has always been like really interesting to me. And dad always had things like New Scientist around, or New Internationalist, or you know, The Economist, and all these sorts of interesting magazines and interesting books.
And then in those years after uni, which is quite a formative time, and you did a huge amount during that time, from interning at the Food Ethics Council to filming Jennifer Lawrence
No, I
an
know.
MTV Movie Award. That's random. Um, what experiences from that time stick out as other influences? Looking forward to where you are now.
Well, I actually think a huge thing actually at university was I did my geography thesis was on food security and no climate change adaptation and food security in sub-Saharan Africa.
Wow,
Um,
big subject.
yeah, not yeah, just go big. um, and I also did a thesis on we had to do I ended up doing like 4 dissertations or something. It was ridiculous.
Glutton for
And I
punishment.
know it's horrible. I know. And but the other big one was on one was on developing countries in the WTO, and another was on the US foreign policy. No, what was it? Role of ideology in
Okay.
US foreign policy.
Yeah, yeah.
Very relevant to today. And I think all those things were very relevant. But the big food security thesis meant that I was very fortunately able to go to Rome to meet people at the UN's Food and Agricultural Organization, the World Food Programme, and the International Federation for Agricultural Development, the 3 core like UN agencies that work on food and agriculture. And that was just like fascinating, I think. And from that kind of spurred me on to the Food Ethics Council, the internship there,
Okay.
which I think my thesis supervisor said, "Oh, you won't get that." He's like, "You won't get that. That'll only take someone who's done a master's or PhD." I was like, "Oh, thank you."
Bit of confidence.
I know, bloody hell, honestly. So, but the Food Ethics Council, who were based in Brighton at the time, were brilliant. If anyone doesn't know them, they're this really small think tank that looks obviously at the ethics in food, and they're really interesting and they really punch above their weight. They've got an incredible board of people, and they're very sort of, I think they're very open-minded, and they don't sort of have this silo mentality that a lot of organizations have. And I think that taught me a lot, that anything to do with food is very complicated, and often there isn't just like one answer. And I think that was critical to like even how I think today. And then I think after that I couldn't find a job, and it was right in the middle of the financial crisis. I graduated in 2009, and there was
not great timing.
it was a nightmare. It was bugger all around if you were a graduate, and it was actually really hard, like really hard. And I think most of my peers, we all ended up having to do like unpaid internships and things like that. And we are the lucky ones, because a lot of people don't have the opportunity to be able to do that, because obviously you need like parents or someone to be able to support you to do that. So yeah, hugely fortunate there. But yeah, I don't know, I ended up having a couple of years of working for nothing or very little, basically. And another one that stuck out was Consumers International in London. I used to go there. I was working like 3 jobs at the time, and half the week was in London. So I was just, it was kind of nutty.
Exhausting.
Yeah, it was exhausting. Yeah. And, all the time, not really being paid. I was paid at Consumers International, but it was kind of like minimum wage. And that was interesting. I got to work on a big project there to do with pineapples and Costa Rica and the issues affecting workers there. And again, a big like supermarket project all around that. Also with Felicity Lawrence, who's a very interesting like Guardian journalist who works on investigative journalists, like working on food. I remember having a conversation with her on the phone about how to get into journalism, and that was really helpful. She was the person actually who said to me, don't even bother with Fleet Street or any of those, because everyone wants to work for them. What you need to go and do is work for a trade journal or like a local or regional paper.
Okay, so it was during that time then that's the sort of seed of, I want to become a food ag journalist, that popped into your mind then?
Yeah, I think it was starting to take form, and I'd also spent 6 months working my arse off at the Green Party, volunteering
Yeah,
like
yeah.
full time. It was in the run up to the 2010 general election, and I
Yeah, and
ended.
that sounded like a big job.
Oh, it was massive, absolutely massive, huge, and I learned so much. I sort of started off as an intern, basically meant to be a comms intern, and ended up managing a team of 5 press people
Wow.
for the Eastern region, um, and like coordinating all of that and running things like the sort of Green Party manifesto launch in the East, and all sorts of things like that, writing speeches for the deputy leader for the Green Party conference.
And then how did you ultimately become deputy business editor at Farmers Weekly?
um it took a long time. It was, oh my
'Cause you
gosh, it was,
you were there for what,
yeah,
4 years?
I was there for 4 years, yeah, but all this time, like, I didn't get that job until I was like 27, and I considered that to be my first like proper job.
Yeah.
um because everything up until that, it was such, like I said, it was unpaid, or it was badly paid, or oh God, it was so frustrating.
Mm.
And so I think I just, when I decided that I wanted to get into journalism, and after having that conversation with Felicity Lawrence, I sort of thought, right, okay, who am I going to try and write for then? And I had my boyfriend at the time was from a farming family, and I remember going to theirs and seeing on the kitchen table Farmers Weekly, and I'd never, I didn't know about it before, because my family, although they had been farmers, they didn't move in farming circles back in Norfolk.
Mm.
And so I was suddenly in this whole farming community in Norfolk through my boyfriend, and um, I sort of thought, oh, okay, Farmers Weekly, maybe I'll try and work for
One of
them.
those aha moments.
Yeah, and I think I didn't really know what to do for a long time, and I sort of spent a lot of time badgering journalists, ringing people up. I spent an enormous amount of time going to conferences, going to seminars, finding people on LinkedIn, ringing them, asking them questions about how to get into something, what skills I needed, that kind of thing, trying to understand. And eventually I ended up doing, I think, oh, I know, I started AgriChat UK. Do you remember that?
You
Started
started
that with
that.
started that with Simon
Ah,
Haley.
that
Yeah,
is a proper claim to fame.
yeah, started that with Simon
Oh, with
Haley.
Simon. Ah, okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
I know what, because I broke my foot, and I was like, well, what am I going to do? Might as well do something useful with my time now. And I was like, right, I'm going to get on Twitter, because a journalist had said to me, get on Twitter because you can get seen on Twitter. It's a very good
Yep,
way to
yep.
get some profile. So I kind of set myself up sort of only talking about food and farming on Twitter.
Hmm.
And then I started to get recognised and seen, and started to make contact with people at Farmers Weekly. And yeah, bumped into Simon on there, and Charles Tassel, and um, somebody from Farmers Weekly, actually Ed from Farmers Weekly.
Okay.
We started AgriChat UK, and then from there, I think I ended up doing work experience at Farmers Weekly. I did the John Deere Training Award,
Yep.
which, if anyone wants to get into journalism, agricultural journalism, is really worthwhile doing, which is like 3 really intense days with somebody called David Mascord, who trained us on things like how to write a news story, journalism law, all sorts of things like that. And that gave me the confidence. And then after that, I applied for a job at Farmers Weekly, and the buggers turned me down. And
How dare they?
how dare they? I was actually, in hindsight, really quite glad, because it was for the
Okay.
arable desk, which
Right.
I would have been terrible at. I would have been absolutely terrible at. Um, uh, so anyway, I sort of licked my wounds, and then spent the next year or something working on everything that they told me that I wasn't any good at, and and then got called in the next time when a job on the business desk came up. Isabel Davies, she rang me up and said,
Okay.
Jez, do you want to apply for this? So I went in and thankfully got the job. And there we were. And I realized as soon as on my first day, I realized that I knew very, very little. And really had to do a lot of catching up in terms of my knowledge of farming, but also in terms of what journalism is and how to write a story and all those things.
And then like we say, you then went on to have four very good years at the Weekly. So why did you decide to leave the job, and how did you end up in South America?
Yes, I had like the years at Farmers Weekly were really, I felt really formative. Like I learned an enormous amount about the industry, but I at the same time, I sort of became quite stressed and felt like once I got the hang of what I was doing, I really wanted to start branching out.
Yeah.
And I ended up in 2016. Do you remember 2015 was when a huge number of people, millions of people started migrating out of Syria
Mm-hmm.
on
Mm-hmm.
foot, all those millions of people walking across
Mm-hmm.
Europe basically. And that really got me, and I thought, you know, maybe I need to try and write a story about this. But obviously a lot of journalists were doing that already. So I kind of waited. And then people were still coming across to Europe, and no one was writing about it suddenly anymore. It's like everyone had kind of moved on, as they do, you know, the media tends to sort of move on and forget about the people left behind who are still dealing with that issue actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I took a week's holiday from Farmers Weekly and went in May 2016 to Lesvos, which is an
Okay.
island in Greece where a lot of refugees were coming across the sea from Turkey and drowning in the sea or washing up on the shores. And of course, now there's terrible sort of overcrowding in the camps on Lesbos Island. And anyway, I took the week off and went to try and write a story about how it was impacting the local people, because I felt no one had really talked about
Okay.
that. So I was just kind of starting to think more widely about these sort of big issues that really interested me and the people kind of dealing with them. And around that sort of time, I think it was probably around March, it was very cold and wet and horrible in London, and London is grisly in winter to live in. And I ended up in a pub in Brixton with my friend Nina, Nina Pullman, who at the time was a journalist at Fresh Produce Journal. She was the deputy editor there. And we were like, bloody hell, like sick of London, and and our jobs are quite hard work, and we want to do something different. What should we do? And we sort of hatched this plan to quit everything and go to South America and sort of
Wow.
travel around different farms and everything. And and then the idea sort of stayed there for a few months, and then I actually became quite unwell, and it was a horrible year. All sorts of things like happened, all sorts of losses and breakups and horrible things.
Yeah.
And I ended up in a really bad place mentally, and things were very stressful at work. And I had this huge trip to China as well, a month out in China and Japan and Hong Kong for Farmers Weekly. I was really struggling, like really, really struggling. And I was like, I can't continue with this, can't go on. So I rang up Nina and was like, Nina, let's go. Like, I can't do this anymore. So, and she was kind of at the point where she wanted to quit as well. So
Okay.
we basically handed in our notices on the same day.
Yeah.
And I'd had a lot, I think I should say, I'd had a lot of support from Farmers Weekly up until that point with everything I was
Yeah.
dealing with. And they were brilliant. And individuals there as well were amazing.
Yeah. Yeah.
But basically, I quit London. I'd sort of, you know, packed up everything in my house, said goodbye to everybody. It was really hard,
Yeah.
and left Farmers Weekly and moved back to Norfolk. And then within 2 weeks, Nina and I were on a plane to Ecuador, and yeah, and then we had this incredible adventure, basically.
And you made a podcast while you were out there called, which is just one of those titles which just works so well. Who gives a fork? Tell me about that.
Yeah, we came up with the name on the plane.
I was guessing that.
We're like, yeah, who gives a fork, or um, forking hell, or you know, that kind of thing. We wanted to practice podcasting, and we didn't have any experience of it. I think I'd done like one course before I'd left or something, and it was such a great opportunity because Nina had worked really hard before we'd left and had set up all these meetings for us through the Ecuadorian embassy in London, through the trade trade missionaire, yeah. We basically like set up all these visits to farms, and then not really knowing anything. Like, so it was incredible. The Ecuadorian like, like government looked after us really well. So we were also backpacking, but in intermittent with all of that, with these little visits that we'd suddenly spend a day going off to visit a farm, and somebody would meet us basically in a massive car and drive us out to this farm where we'd be met by the farmer or farm manager or something. We'd have a tour, we'd like scribble loads of notes, and then sort of go off to the side and be like, wait, what's the story? Because normally you turn up with an idea of what the story is beforehand, but we had no idea until we turned up what the story was going to be. So we sort of recorded everything kind of off the cuff in these farms, and then spent the time on buses. We spent hours, days, nights on buses, oh my god, around Ecuador and Colombia, with this incredible like reggaeton music playing, or some kind of awful violent film on the TVs and everything going on. But the whole way round, we were listening to our podcast recordings and making notes about what we wanted to kind of make it into. Okay. And then we were editing them and adding links in and things like that.
I mean, what I find amazing through all this, and sort of in quite a short number of years, really, and this includes your Farmers Weekly time and all that web of experiences before that, and into the South American time as well. You've got a really rich collection of experience there, and this links into something that I know you wanted to talk about, which we mentioned we've been talking about of our email before this, but it's the idea of, number one, the importance of travel and variety of experience within journalism and the people who are writing, creating food and farming stories, but also critically this idea of nuance. How healthy are those ideas in the world of food and farming journalism at the moment, do you think?
Well, I think they're very mixed, and I'm sure a lot of people listening to this, especially if they're farmers, will recognize this, that we are at a point where a lot of media just goes for the big headlines, and there's a real problem that a lot of nuance is being lost, particularly in, I think, stories like about food, about farming, about science, about all sorts of things. I think we're in real danger there, because the issues that we're facing in terms of feeding ourselves and looking after the natural world are hugely complex. And when the vast majority of the public reads those sorts of mainstream articles that basically reduce an incredibly complex thing into something that seems very simple, they basically give a simple answer, which obviously at the moment is go vegan, and that in itself, I mean, I could talk about that forever, and I won't, I'll bore people, but I think there are real problems there, and we see it in all sorts of stories, not just food and farming. But we've kind of got two poles at the moment, and there's something in the middle that is often lacking. On the one end, we've got the agricultural press that really understands the issues facing farmers, right? But sometimes I think doesn't look widely enough, doesn't always write with the consumer in mind. And that is like a massive part, obviously, of the of the food system. And so understanding things like what ordinary people care about, or the issues around things like poverty or inequality, health, all those things that I think need to be somehow woven in a bit more to the what farmers are reading. And then on the other side, the other kind of end of the spectrum, we have mainstream press, mainstream media, mainstream journalists who are quite out of touch with the realities in farming, the realities that farmers face, and why they make the decisions that they do, why they do the things they do, and how that is influenced completely by like policy, regulations, culture, and consumer demand, and supermarkets, and all those sort of actors. And so I think a lot of the journalists and editors that have the beat of food, farming, science in the mainstream press don't necessarily have the grounding in that subject, other than through having read a lot of stuff themselves, or having maybe studied something like what I did, politics, sociology, something like that at university. And so we've got this sort of thing in the middle that is the nuance that doesn't happen very often. And especially the last year, like I've been to a lot of seminars, conferences, particularly normally covering for Farmers Guardian, because I think they have been really pushing things at the moment, and recognizing that, you know, things like agroecology and that kind of thing, like they're important things to be looking at more. But I've been to so many seminars and things like that where the whole thing is about nuance. Like all the presentations and everything people are saying comes to the conclusion that this is very, very complex, and, you know, like deciding what to eat and what is sustainable is a very, very complex thing.
I do think travel is really important in terms of food and farming stories. I think it's critical because our food system is global, our food chains are global, and if I'm going to write about, I don't know, like cacao farmers or banana farmers or coffee farmers or issues in that supply chain, like I have so much more understanding if I can go and do it. I think it humanizes those producers in the chain, because something like chocolate or coffee or tea or cotton or anything like that, these are like vast, like huge global commodities, you know, some of the world's biggest commodities, that it's very difficult often as a consumer or even a journalist or a reader or whatever to distill that down to the people involved. And a lot of the, you know, the big issues involved in those supply chains, they only really like start to make sense when you boil it down, right down, you trace it all the way back to an individual person and how they're being affected by something. And then when you put it in the context of like where they're living and the whole historical, cultural, environmental issues all around that, we can't be like decent consumers, responsible consumers, unless those sorts of stories bring those people's lives like onto our like screens or in our newspapers or whatever it is. And that's why I think it's like so important, because these massive global issues that we're dealing with, climate change, inequality, health, obviously right now, all these things are all interlinked. And it's not okay to just be like, well, that's over there, that's not really anything to do with me. Actually, it is. It's like totally to do with us.
Do you think that that conversation is being had enough within the ag journalism community?
I think there is like a real frustration in the ag community and in the farming press that the mainstream press gets it wrong often. And what I was going to say with those seminars is that everyone I've been to, like, that is the main thing that comes out, that this is complex, and the nuance is that scientists, anybody who's presenting is trying to communicate that nuance. But often the room of journalists, who mostly are mainstream journalists, they're not tuning into that. What they're tuning into, because they're journalists and because they're looking for a story, they're not tuning into it, and they're completely missing the point. And I've been in rooms where the questions afterwards that are asked, it's obvious that they've totally missed the point often, you know. And what I've seen sometimes is that those people have asked their question and they framed it in a way that is very much, they've already decided what their story is going to be, and they don't really listen. And then you see the headline a few hours later and it's caused real problems. And I've interviewed like a lot of the scientists like afterwards who are so frustrated by that. And, you know, they're like, that's not what I said, or that's been taken out of context, or, you know, and it's causing real problems because it feels like often the press has decided what the story is going to be. And at the moment, that's, you know, for example, it is around like that we all need to eat, like basically go vegan. That's just one example, you know, or it could be, I don't know, reforestation, it could be anything like that. But there's no and it's a real problem, I think.
I mean, so you're moving to Portugal, or I mean, technically have moved to Portugal, and moving back soon, maybe, hopefully. What's next?
Well, before I moved to Portugal, actually, my harebrained idea was to spend, was it 6 cities in 6 months in Europe?
Wow.
Yeah, which I sort of came back from South America, having done these like really big like stories that were exhausting but like amazing. And then I got back and I was like, actually, that's just a bit tiring, isn't it? I don't think I can do that. So I think I'm gonna try Lisbon and Portugal for a little while, and I can just work as normal basically from out there because all I need is internet connection, so I can work from anywhere in the world, which is great. I'm just gonna see how that goes. But my original plan was to basically lay claim to an EU country before the end of the transition period. Because otherwise after that it becomes much harder. So I'm going to be in Portugal, and they're very welcoming of foreigners. Take note, UK. Have a massive, great big banner outside their town hall that just says "Migrants Welcome." So Thank you very much. So I'm going to try that out for a little while, and I think dig into the food and farming stories that are there. I already know there's a lot of incredible like food produced there. I'm talking at the moment to the travel magazine about some a food story with local producers in Alentejo region, and I know Portugal has some interesting stuff around. I'm hopefully looking at wildfires there as well, and the kind of link up with farming and land use. And then also I know there's a lot going on in terms of water security around Lisbon in terms of farming. So lots to be busy with. But when I get back, I'm just gonna, I think, have a beer in the sun, to be honest.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. Honestly, your drive is so inspiring. Have a brilliant time in Portugal.
Thanks, Ben.
Meet the farmers' friends.
Food and farming journalist Jez Fredenburgh. Don't forget to head to YouTube for the full version of that interview. Just search for Meet the Farmers podcast, Jez Fredenburgh. That's all we have time for today, but thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe to the show if you haven't already done so you never miss another episode. Big thanks to today's guest, Jez, and the show supporters, the Mercer Family Charitable Foundation. Next week, I'll be speaking to Ernie Richards, who is County Chair of Herefordshire Young Farmers and also a first-generation farmer working as a shepherd in mid-Wales. Until then, have a great week, and I'll see you next time on Meet the Farmers.